Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Horizon Ballroom of the Ronald Reagan Center, International Trade Building. We are delighted to be here tonight. This program is being televised. It will be for tape-delayed broadcast on our one-hour weekly television show, World Affairs Today, which is on MHC Networks. We're also looking at an expansion of our television broadcasting in 2016. That will take it to 68 to 72 million homes. More on that later. Tonight, we've got a topic that should be of interest to anyone, whether they're an immigrant to the United States, whether a native-born American, whether they're people who are here visiting. We have three distinguished people with us tonight on this panel. And I include Rachel, our moderator from Congressional Quarterly, among that complement. My name is Tony Cully Foster. I have the honor of being the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council. We're a leading institution for global education and international affairs. Our commitment is to being a place where learning happens. Tonight, we ask you to be part of that process. Please, as you listen to our speakers tonight, think of questions that you would like to ask from people who are knowledgeable, who are experts on our topic tonight. Below the Statue of Liberty, you'll find the words of Emma Lazarus. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Our world is currently facing yet another dire humanitarian crisis. According to the UN High Commission on Refugees, at the end of 2014, there were more than 20 million refugees worldwide. Sectarian violence, war, extremism have forced more than 60 million people from their homes, communities, and nations. In 2015, the United States is confronted with helping the international community assist the transition of the largest number of refugees since the horrors of World War II. Many of these displaced people are from the Middle East, in particular, Iraq and Syria, two predominantly Muslim nations. A third of the world's current refugees come from these two nations alone. And Syria in 2015 has the dubious honor of being the worldwide leading source of refugees. For the past year, the world and Americans have watched as millions of refugees have streamed into Europe, desperately seeking a respite, a new beginning, a safe haven from the violence, war, terrorism, and armed conflict in their home countries. The brutal Paris terrorist attacks on November 15th awakened fears that potential anti-Western terrorists could disguise themselves as refugees, mingle with the displaced people, and gain access to carry out similar attacks in other nations, including the U.S. During the past few months, American leaders and politicians have called into question the U.S. policies concerning acceptance of refugees, our visa waiver program with 20-plus nations that are allies of the United States. Some national leaders have called for an all-out halt. Other politicians say no, or wish to limit refugees into their states, particularly those who come from Muslim nations. In 2015, as Europe has been asked to take in the bulk of the refugees, Germany decided to be a world leader and take in over 1 million people who are refugees, despite growing national opposition by its citizens. German Chancellor Angela Merkel has stood by her personal decisions on these refugee policies, despite growing security fears that her country's security, economic development, and social services will be put at risk for this and future generations. The German Chancellor rejected criticism of her 2015 open door policy, saying Europe must tackle the causes of the refugee and migration crisis by working harder with all Western nations to secure the basis for a permanent peace in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan in particular, and to have a global community coalition help defeat ISIS and secure national borders. As of January 2012, an estimated 13.3 million green card holders live in the United States, including an estimated 8.8 million eligible to become U.S. citizens. The U.S. had 40 million foreign-born residents in 2010 in its population of approximately 320 million. They included 11 million, almost 30%, who were illegally present in our nation. The U.S. has more foreign-born residents than any other country in the world, 3 times more than Russia, the country with the second largest number of immigrants. Around 720,000 refugees have been resettled in the United States of America since 2000. The current U.S. refugee resettlement program in the U.S. is a long and bureaucratic process. It can take 3 to 5 years to complete. The United States land border is 12,024 kilometers, approximately 8,000 miles. Plus, it has a large and vulnerable coastal border. Many have argued that recent policy decisions are being made in an effort to put up a land and sea wall as a protection zone around the United States. Refugees are displaced and vulnerable people who are in need of organized, timely, compassionate, secure, and professional assistance to live safely and securely in a new country. Those who love their country don't emigrate by choice. They do so because the ethos of the United States and other democracies is such that they seek a better, safer place for themselves and their families. The UN estimates that 2,500 people have lost their lives on risky sea journeys as they've tried to escape violence and repression in their home nations. No one can forget the unforgettable image of the Syrian child washed ashore on that Mediterranean beach, the tip of an iceberg. The father of this boy was quoted as saying, "It is too late for my family, too late for Aylan, but we all need your help. We need collective action, understanding, and a plan to move urgently. I hope that you all understand. It could happen to anyone's family, So open your hearts, countries, and homes to help us. The iconic words on the Great Seal of the United States of America in Latin are E pluribus unum, out of many one. Our diversity in this nation is its strength. Our working together with mutual respect for individual differences is the essence of our democracy and our nation. Tonight, we're honored to be joined at this podium by two experts in national and global policy issues related to refugees, migration. We are also fortunate to have an experienced moderator who's involved with congressional and administrative oversight issues. Samuel Witten, who served for 22 years, on the far left here, as a lawyer and policy official in the U.S. Department of State from 2007 to 2010. Sam served as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration. Michel Gabaudan is the President of Refugees International. He, like my wife, is a proud Provençal, and I am very happy that he has served in the United Nations High Commission on Refugees for 25 years with great distinction. Our moderator for this evening is Rachel Oswald, currently a reporter for CQ Roll Call in Washington, where she focuses on congressional oversight. I ask you to put your hands together in an international welcome to our three distinguished panelists. Rachel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tony. This morning, Congress released its long-awaited fiscal 2016 spending bill. The bill will provide roughly $1 billion in increased funding for programs to support refugees in the United States and abroad. And while this funding will be welcomed by many, it remains unclear, however, whether the new funding will be enough to meet President Obama's stated goal of resettling 10,000 Syrian refugees in the country this fiscal year, or whether it will be enough to meet the much more ambitious goal of resettling 100,000 Syrian refugees that many humanitarian groups are promoting. Republicans had promised to try to block funding for Syrian refugees in the bill, but were strongly opposed by Democrats. The fight is not over, though. As we speak, members of the conservative House Freedom Caucus are pushing an amendment to the spending bill that would block funding for the resettlement of refugees from Syria, Iraq, Somalia, Libya, Uzbekistan, and Bosnia. All of this is happening, as Tony mentioned, against a backdrop of rising anti-refugee comments, many of them from conservatives. In the days following the Paris terror attack, we saw roughly 24 governors, many of them Republicans, state that they did not want to accept refugees in their territory. The federal government does have the right to resettle refugees. The Constitution grants it that power, but we may see court cases on this nonetheless. And of course, we have Republican presidential candidates, namely Donald Trump, urging that all Muslims be banned from entering the country. And then you have candidates, while presenting themselves as more reasonable alternatives to Trump, namely Ted Cruz and Jeb Bush, urging that Christian refugees receive prioritization and resettlement over Muslims. All of this incendiary talk is having a real impact on how Americans think on the subject. For example, a poll released Monday by Siena College found that 52% of registered voters in New York State, a fairly liberal state, oppose admitting Syrian refugees into the country at this time. Against all of this, we have seen a number of religious faith leaders unite in calling for the resettlement of refugees, but it's not clear if that will be enough to turn the tide in public thinking. Before I turn over the microphone to our first panelist, Michel Gabaudan, I wanted to provide a little bit of background on the government screening process. The process takes roughly between 18 months to 2 years, and that is after asylum candidates have received initial screening from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. The screening process includes the collection of biometric information such as fingerprints and multiple in-person interviews designed to confirm that individuals really do meet the requirements to be considered a refugee. Earlier in the year, the Obama administration put in place an added layer of scrutiny for Syrian refugees that includes additional probes of their personal backgrounds and the cross-checking of their identities against multiple terrorism and criminal databases. All of this amounts to more scrutiny than any other category of traveler to the United States. In selecting refugees for admittance to the country, the United States prioritizes receiving women, children, the elderly, and the sick. Single men make up less than 2% of all Syrian refugee admissions to date, compared to roughly 77% women and children. Since the beginning of fiscal 2011, the United States has admitted a relatively small number of Syrian refugees, approximately 2,200. So with that, I'll turn the microphone over to Michel for his opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and good evening. I'll start perhaps by giving you some general context to explain where the debate on resettlement sits from an international perspective. So 20% of the world refugees today are Syrians. If you add to that the number of Syrians who have been displaced but stayed within their country, it's 8 million more. And that means that in the past 4 years, more than 50% of the pre-war population has been displaced by the conflict or by persecution. We have witnessed no such crisis in the previous century and this one in terms of this percentage of the population that suffers brutal displacement. And I have traveled extensively in Turkey, in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Iraq, even in Egypt, where all these refugees find themselves. I heard their stories, and we must keep in mind very clearly that refugees are those who flee the terrorists, that have suffered abuse by the terrorists, whether it's by the Assad regime or by ISIS or by other groups, but they are the victims of the violence that prevails in the region. Now, the response to the refugee crisis, traditionally there is a UN agency, the Refugee Agency coordinates the response. It works very much with international non-governmental agencies, many of them American, who are very competent, like the IRC, like Save the Children, like Oxfam, and I'm not exhausted, there are many others. And the US has traditionally been the major donor to the UN. The UN humanitarian response is based on voluntary funding. It relies on the goodwill of governments to provide support. This has nothing to do with the way the New York Office of the Secretary General is funded, which is by assessed contribution. And the US is traditionally the largest funder of refugee relief. And I used to be the head of fundraising for the UN Refugee Agency when I came very often to Washington in the late 90s. And I can tell you, whether you met Democrat or Republican congressmen or senators, there was absolute agreement from all sides that this was a non-partisan issue, that this is something the US wanted to do as a country. It's been one of the most satisfying work to do on the Hill. Traditionally, the US says it will not fund more than 25% of the budget of a UN organization. It sometimes ends up funding a bit more because other donors are not coming up with the sort of commitments they should have. A refugee crisis evolves from the initial emergency when people arrive to a period of stabilization, and then we have to look for solutions. And the solutions for the past 50 years that we've been dealing with international program for refugees have not changed. It is priority, return to your country when it is feasible. That is becoming increasingly a challenge in the world. When I started about 30 years ago to work with refugees, the average time someone was a refugee was 4 years. Today it's close to 20. And that's because not only do we have new conflicts that have produced large number of refugees, but all conflicts have not been sorted out. Think of the DRC, think of Somalia, think of Afghanistan. People who fled these places 25 years ago are still refugee, are still looking for some sort of a solution. Second solution is try to integrate them locally. Very few governments are prepared to do that. There have been some moves recently, and it's something that the UN is fighting to try to achieve. We cannot keep people in camp or in an unstable situation for a long time. And then there is the famous resettlement. Now, the resettling countries in the world are traditionally, there are three leaders in resettlement, the US first, then Canada and Australia, and then a whole lot of other countries that come behind, but with much smaller numbers. In the best of years, there are 100,000 refugees resettled in a year. you consider that there are today 20 million refugees, you can see that this is a very small solution for refugees. And the question is, why does it matter? And it matters, in my view, for two reasons. One, it's a manifestation of burden sharing. Most of the refugees live in what we call the Greater South or the Third World, and they stay there forever. If we start taking some refugees from them, we show that we don't consider it's just their problem, that we are prepared to extend a hand also. It's a way to commit our societies also to a better understanding of what's happening in the world, but it's also a way to help the most vulnerable. UNHCR is the main agency referring cases to the US or to other governments, and it follows a pretty strict process. First, it registers refugees when they arrive as a part of protection role so that refugees are identified. That registration over the past years have taken very strict mechanism, and now you even have the iris, I don't know, the photography. So you can't have people that are more easy to track after that. In the Middle East, because of the number of refugees, when a refugee arrives in Turkey or Jordan, he gets an invitation to register if he shows up at an office, and the registration takes about a year after, because there's such a backlog, and the UN is understaffed in general. So already a year before it's registered. Once it's registered, the UN will assess whether some have expressed an interest to be resettled or whether the UN thinks that some should be resettled because their particular condition makes that their survival in the country of first asylum remains difficult. And it will therefore select these people and interview them. In that process, more than 60% will be dropped, either because their stories in 2 different interviews don't match, or because all of a sudden a brother or an uncle that was not mentioned before appears before. There are some problems of credibility, and there are many of these. And it's only after that process, which is at least a second year, that the files are being submitted to different countries. The US program has a tremendous quality that it does not assess people on whether they are good immigrant cases. They speak English or they are IT specialists, etc. No, they assess the need for resettlement on the basis of vulnerability. And these will include women-headed households, unaccompanied minors, people who have been victims of torture, members of special groups, LGBT in particular, or people who are still under threat in asylum countries like bloggers or journalists, people who have had very strong opinions and could still be chased, though they are outside their country of origin, by the security services of the country they fled. So these are priority for resettlement. In other words, no angry, bearded man. This is not what we are going to propose to the countries who resettle. In that process, refugees cannot choose where they will go. The UN does the whole process, and then it will submit to different countries depending on the desire expressed by the countries to see these files. And there will be, sometimes people were thinking they would go to the US and they'll end up in Sweden or in Germany or in Australia. The only time when there might be a preferential presentation to one country is that there are obvious family links already in this country to try to maintain some sort of family unity. So I would argue very strongly when we talk about vetting that the UN process is already a first level of vetting because it eliminates many and because it chooses people who are the most vulnerable. And because the process takes so much time, it has a chance over these years to follow the people who have been registered, who have been identified, to make sure that they remain refugees with all the prerogatives of refugees. The High Commissioner, and I'll end up very quickly on that, the High Commissioner for Refugees has asked the international community to consider resettling 10,000 of the Syrian refugee population, which is 400,000 over the next years, as a clear manifestation of support to Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria, who really have made a tremendous gesture in receiving refugees. In Lebanon today, 1 inhabitant in 4 is a Syrian. Can you imagine that would mean for the US in terms of having Canadians or Mexicans? It would be a massive social issue. Well, it has not become that bad in Lebanon, but the countries are bursting at the seam. Their ability to cope with these refugees is reduced. Funding has become less available, and it is time to show some support. To date, the High Commissioner has received not pledges, but manifestations of interest, which is a bit of a less strong commitment, for about 160. So still short of his proposal, but still countries have come with, we could perhaps manage 160 to start with. The reason we have seen such a large outflow towards Europe at the end of 2014 and very much in 2015, with all these images of the boats arriving from Turkey to Greece, is essentially because refugees who until 2013, and they told me very clearly, we want to go back to Syria as soon as we can. They had no idea of moving out. Now they have become despairing that there will be a peace process meaningful in the foreseeable future in Syria. And as I said before, the countries who hosted them initially, Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, are bursting at the seams. People have exhausted their economies. Very few of their children can go to school, and they're becoming desperate. And that's what has promoted that large movement towards Europe. But it's a movement that only those who have the funds to pay the smugglers can make. All the others, those that we don't see, remain there, and they are slowly pushed from poverty to misery as their resources dwindle. So we have a crisis on our hands that is far from being resolved. I was mentioning initially that there are 8 million people displaced inside Syria. They keep on coming out as the conflict drags on. So the refugee outflow will keep on having. Resettlement will be a small part of the response. We have to build the way we respond in the region, but I think it's an important part in addressing the needs of the most vulnerable of them. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Michel. Sam?
Thank you. Let me just say it's a pleasure to be on a panel with Rachel, of course, but with Michel Gabaudan, who I've known for many years, and who has been a true leader internationally on refugee relief. I met him in 2007 when I had the privilege of stepping into the position of Acting Assistant Secretary of State for Refugee Programs, as the official title is Population, Refugees, and Migration. And Michel was in a group of elders, if you will, who advised the State Department on the priorities and helped us coordinate our own understanding of some of the crises around the world. So I'll talk in a moment about the screening process and about how the United States handles incoming refugees. I'd like to take a step back and put this issue of refugee resettlement in context, because it happens that, in part because of the political season that we're in, because of the reaction of governors to Syrian refugees and similar things, there is likely to be a misimpression among a lot of Americans, those listening to these, paying attention for the first time to the issue of refugees, that this is the U.S. Refugee Assistance Program. It's obviously not. Most refugees, as Michel just explained, are not coming for resettlement. The vast majority of refugees are trying to go back to their homes in safety and dignity. And for the entire time that the UN Refugee Agency has existed, that has been the ultimate goal. That is to help people return safely. The UN Refugee Agency obviously does not act alone because it can't bring peace to terrible situations. But what it does is shelter in place refugees in not just the Middle East, but Burma, outside of Burma, the Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America. There are refugees all over the world who have in common the fact that they have left their place of nationality, left their homes, and cannot go back safely. That's what this is all about. So the U.S. program on this, and my connection with it was in the Iraqi refugee program from 2007 to 2010, when I was the acting assistant secretary or principal deputy assistant secretary at various times for refugee programs at the State Department. That was a massive effort for all of us. And let me just give you a little background, because we were doing two things at once. We were trying to get adequate resources to refugee relief officials, refugee agencies like the UN, like the International Committee of the Red Cross, the International Rescue Committee, International Medical Corps, these key international institutions, whether intergovernmental organizations or nonprofits, who were trying to help the masses of refugees who were not trying to resettle, but simply survive. So in the budget that I was involved in with Iraqi refugees, we had an aggregate, when you add it all up, of about $1.6 billion that we were managing, not just for Iraqis, this is the worldwide program. Of that 1.6 billion, probably about $1.3 billion, and most of the staff that I had of 135 people at the State Department and at various embassies weren't dealing with the issue of resettlement, but were dealing with the issue of how to help refugees in place, wherever they were, whether it's camps or urban settings or otherwise. And a lot of our efforts was just trying to triage, because that sounds like a lot of money, but it's not, because the need is so much greater. One thing, when you hear refugee professionals talk about the needs and what we're doing, remember that this addresses a fraction of what the needs are. The US has been a leader. The Europeans are great at it. Some other countries, Australia and some others, have stepped forward, but I can't emphasize enough, and I learned this sort of in the middle of a crisis, so it really came home to me, how important the United States is in this international system. It's not merely that we give 25, 30, 40% of the total money. We have career people in the State Department and in other agencies, including DHS, who understand this international system, who understand the way it works. And we are value added countless times. I went to Geneva 7 times in the span of 12 or 18 months for meetings at the UN Refugee Agency with the International Red Cross. And we were always welcome, not because of the money, it's because we had a bipartisan support of Congress. That's why it turns my stomach to hear, this is a Republican issue, a Democratic issue. Ted Kennedy created the Refugee Act of 1980. But in the 25 years since then, until this year, I've always seen it, known it, lived it as a bipartisan issue. This is really stunning that we are dealing with the Republicans saying, oh, President Obama is reckless and he's bringing all these refugees in. This has been a program under both administrations. I was a career person. I wasn't a political appointee, but I can tell you in the Bush administration, which is when I assumed the rank of acting assistant secretary, there was 100% commitment to trying to get as much funds as possible to help the refugee program. And when Secretary Clinton came in to replace Secretary Rice, there was no difference. We were all still there. It's the same group of dedicated professionals who are trying to do as much as possible. So again, this isn't to belittle the fact that we're not doing enough to bring in refugees into the United States, but I just wanted to be sure that we had in context that not only the UN system is built around protection in place, but most US funding, most US effort, and frankly, more professionals at the State Department and other agencies are dealing with relief where in situ, where the people are located. Okay, so that's my background. Let me just talk I want to cover 2 other things at the risk of talking too much. I'd like to talk about the US government agencies that deal with this and sort of explain how they relate to each other and to refugee relief. And then I'd like to talk just for a moment about the screening process. Michel brought it to the point of the UN High Commission for Refugees helping identify and recommend, and I'll just talk briefly about what happens once we are handed a file from the UN High Commission for Refugees and we have to deal with it. So the cast of characters in the United States, apart from Congress, which is responsible for funding and oversight, and I don't belittle that for a second. I'll talk though about the executive branch because that's where I spent my 22 years at the State Department. Within the State Department, there is a bureau called the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. It has a great advantage because it sits as a part of the internal State Department structure, and it has Foreign Service officers and civil service who are embedded in the department. It's not like it's an outside non-governmental organization. We have the mission of managing the money, of representing to Congress, dealing with the UN, but also PRM was and is an advocate within the State Department for refugee issues. When, for example, we dealt with Somalis who were streaming during the hardest parts of the Civil War into Kenya, Tanzania, Ethiopia, it was the same professionals who now are dealing with Syria we're dealing with stability in those countries and funding, and obviously there are multiple issues to help the refugees, but also when you have tens and hundreds of thousands of refugees, you're potentially destabilizing the countries that they come to. So we have two things going on at once. We have to help them and help the individual countries. And we were talking beforehand, Jordan is a classic example of some of the pressures that come about because of refugee situations. In the Iraqi crisis, Iraqis, Jordan has many, many Palestinians. It is a country, it's a monarchy. It only has so many schools, so many hospitals, so much infrastructure. And when the refugees from Iraq started screaming in, and now it's more complicated because of Syria, they're competing for the same social services with locals, with Jordanians. And in Lebanon, it's just absolutely mind-boggling, the numbers now with the Syrians. When I was there, the Lebanese were dealing with Palestinians, 400,000 in various UN camps, plus uninvited countless Iraqis who they couldn't stay in Iraq because of these hostilities, and they were flooding into Lebanon. So the countries are facing a stability issue, and the refugees are facing antagonism often from the countries that they can go to, and they often can't get any further. So if you wonder about these boatloads of people who are making their way across the Mediterranean trying to get to Europe, it's likely because they have given up hope, or at least for the moment they've given up hope of going back to their country of nationality. They're not being accepted in the country of asylum. It's called the first country of asylum, the first place that they go to. So they want to keep going. And some of it's the magnet that they hear Europe's accepting it, but some of it's total desperation, that they can't go anywhere, they can't go back, they can't stay where they are. Those are the first two choices. And then they move on and go to Europe. Some are, and Europe is, from North Africa into Italy and Malta and moving up, south-north. Now you have the Western and Northwestern movement from Iraqis, but now many more Syrians. And it's a very complicated situation. And a lot of I'm telling you all this in part because I think it's important to understand the total fabric of the way the U.S. government handles this. But also it's important to understand it because some of the talk that is in the press now, it's as if President Obama woke up and decided to bring refugees into the United States. This has been one of the crown jewels of United States policy for decades, that we welcome people into the United States, and candidly, we're helping many more people who have no interest in coming to the United States just survive. So there are countless pressures on this system. I call it the infrastructure of, you have the UN High Commission for Refugees, then you have a lot of other intergovernmental organizations like the ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross, and you have International Organization of Migration, and lots of NGOs, lots of well-meaning people who put their lives on the line to help these refugees. So let's talk about the process into the United States. So you have the UN High Commissioner for Refugees has this elaborate screening system themselves. They don't want to refer people who are not in need. So they're not going to do the massive security checks, but they want to figure out the stories of the people who are saying, I'm a refugee, I need assistance. And they need it both for the issue of referrals for resettlement, but they also need to know that the people that they're helping with their limited budget are actually people in need. And it's often, sometimes desperate people do desperate things, and they get mixed in, and a migrant says, I'm a refugee, an economic migrant, somebody just looking for a better job, might need to be screened out, and the UN has good systems in place, so it's a separate conversation. So with respect to the resettlement of refugees, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees has professionals who identify them. They come. The State Department has contractors all over the world. These are professionals who are well trained in trying to assess the cases that are referred to the United States by the UN. They might be the International Rescue Committee, it could be the International Organization for Migration, it could be a faith-based organization, and there are different ones in different parts of the world. And they do what's called case preparation. They do an in-person interview, they get information about the person, and they make an initial assessment. Is this person Is the story credible? Does it hold up? Is this somebody that we should take to the next step in the process? Then names go in, and there's security screening at various points. I'm not an expert in the reforms that have happened in the years since I left, but I do know that we have the intelligence community, we have DHS, we have the National Counterterrorism Center, the FBI's Terrorist Screening Center, the Departments of Homeland Security, State and Defense, and intelligence community agencies all playing a role trying to figure out at an early point whether to stop movement. Then there has to be an in-person, so people fall out along the way. Then DHS has a requirement of an in-person screening. That is, DHS officers, Michel, you were mentioning there are 20 now. Was that in Turkey or Jordan? You said there were 20?
20,000 have been referred from the 3 countries. Yep.
But in terms of the large, maybe I heard it elsewhere. There are now 20, the way this works, and I've seen it in operation, a refugee applicant sits across in person, it can't be done by video, from a DHS screener. The DHS screener does an assessment, just like if you imagine somebody saying that they're really not an intending immigrant, but they're coming for vacation. But it's much more serious when, in a consular setting. So you have an in-person, and they're screened, and they can say no if they're unsure. They can take it to the next step if they're comfortable, because there are additional screenings that take place after the initial DHS screening. Then there are biometrics that Michel referred to, a medical check. And then for those that have, and this all takes a lot of time, in part because of the security screening, but in part because it just takes a lot of time, because you have the UN process to try to identify the people actually in need. You have the State Department, let's say it's International Rescue Committee, the State Department contractor that does the interview to decide whether it's a case that you keep moving. Then you have security checks, and you have a DHS in-person interview. All this takes a long time, and there are only so many DHS people that are available. They're called, the nickname, they're circuit riders. Like, think back to the Old West, where a sheriff would go to different states at different times. These are circuit riders, DHS people, often in their first 10 or 15 years of their career, go and meet in person. And then what happens when they come into the United States? They're assigned, there are amazing nonprofits all over the United States, in every state, who are responsible for helping welcome these people who've been through the screening. There's HHS steps in at this point. They have Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR, which is responsible for helping fund some of the initial, it was 7 or 8 months. I don't know what it is now. It's 5 months.
And then they can extend for the most vulnerable.
Okay, so it's 5 months of support. It's kind of like welfare, just to be sure people survive. And these local agencies help them with medical appointments, enroll their kids in school, help them with language if they need it, with job training and all that stuff. And then that's the final step, that there are these often faith-based, not always. CCB, U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, is a major player in terms of helping refugees who are admitted into the United States. I think at one point, 1/3 of the refugees that came into the United States were helped by the Catholic Church in some way or other. The Lutherans are involved, the HIAS, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society is involved, and a lot of non-religious. I'll stop. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Sam and Michel, for those excellent, very thorough remarks. And you guys talking, you actually gave me a couple of ideas from some stories I want to report. In organizing this event, the World Affairs Council had hoped to get a House lawmaker for the panel, someone who had voted in favor of a bill in November that would have effectively halted for a period of maybe 1 to 2 years the resettlement of Syrian and Iraqi refugees. But this being one of the busiest times of the year for Congress, that wasn't possible. So I will be trying to fill the role of what they might say, and also considering that news from the weekend that Austrian authorities had arrested 2 men, reportedly French citizens, in an asylum center in Salzburg. The men were reportedly being held on suspicion of planning terrorist attacks. Why should the United States not fear terrorists sneaking in as refugees, recognizing that it would be less than 1% if it did happen at all?
If you want to give me an assurance that there will be a mechanism whereby we have a zero, absolute zero risk, of course there is none. What I'm absolutely convinced right now is that first the selection of refugees is already focused on the most vulnerable people already, that vets them, and it's the most severe vetting system you have. I mean, so far I think 2,000 Syrians have come to the US as refugees. In the same time, more than 10 times that number have come through other means, which are much less vetted.
You mean come into the United States?
To the United States.
Under work visas, and so
under work
Syrians
visas,
in the United
yeah.
States for other reasons.
The other thing is that the main source of terrorism, ISIL, etc., we know there are lots of people who are not Syrians in that group, etc. So to say that the refugee is the way you protect yourself the most is damning the most victimized people in the region without really, I think, and I'm not a security expert, but really addressing your genuine security concern. I sit pretty much in between the people who say 10,000 is fine and those who want 100,000. I think it's going to be a long process to vet the Syrians. I think if we can start with 10,000 and see how it goes, how the different departments that Sam mentioned are able to cope with that and provide the right answers, we will see what that can be increased or no. But as you just mentioned, in Austria, the two people were French. Most of the terrorist acts have been homegrown, not through refugees we have brought. And I don't have the exact statistics, but when you talk to security agencies, they tell you refugees are not, the people who have been resettled are not among the groups that have been identified as risk over the past 10 or 20 years. There is no evidence that this is a group which is any serious risk for any country.
Sam, my question for you is from something you said in your remarks that was very interesting to me. You said that it turned your stomach how aid for refugees, a formerly bipartisan issue, appears to become a partisan issue. And what I want to hear from you is, are you concerned that this, in the current political climate, could become permanent, or if after the presidential elections are over, it will pass? I'm reminded that climate change was actually in the past, as recent as a decade ago, fairly bipartisan. You had John McCain in the 2008 race saying, you know, it was time to address it aggressively, and the cap and trade bill promoted by Obama that didn't succeed was originally a Republican idea. And now many Republicans will say climate change is not happening and the government should not take action on that. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I can just tell you anecdotally that when I, back in the day, again, this is Iraq, which was the last crisis, so you try to learn from what happened before. When we briefed both House and Senate committees and staffers on Iraq, it was not, did George Bush make a horrible mistake by invading Iraq, and therefore the Democrats don't want to fund it or do want to fund it. You know, it was, tell us about the situation. Who are these people? Where are they? What's the next step? And that was a time when I could have easily seen their politics creeping in a really bad way for the refugees, because the only reason that the U.S. was on the hook for a lot of this was the fact that we made the judgment in 2003 to invade Iraq and topple Saddam Hussein. But it was always bipartisan, and it was always thoughtful, and I never had, in those contexts, a political word back and forth. I'm hoping that after the election, maybe even after the primaries are over on the Republican side, there can be more rational discussion of this issue. Right now, it is, just to give one example, you know, the president made his announcement, I forget exactly when, November, whenever that was, about 10,000 Syrian refugees, October, November, September. And, you know, I've heard, like Donald Trump says, I can't believe they want to bring in 250,000. And then somebody else says some other exotic number of 100,000 or 150,000. And it really is not meant to discuss the issue or the security issue, but it's to make a point that's political and to show that in their view, the president's irresponsible. So I'm hoping that, once there is a nominee on the Republican side, that things calm down a little bit. But this is, I lived this for enough time to know how valuable it is to have bipartisan support, and this is a very strange season. That said, and I just want to say one other word. A lot of the refugee situations around the world don't have this baggage. The United States has supported, refugee relief and return for decades in Africa and Asia and Southeast Asia, and the refugee and displaced person scene in Afghanistan and Pakistan has been going on since, we were so actively engaged there and before, from the Taliban, and that's bipartisan. So it happens that the timing really came together of a political season, a xenophobia, a real concern. I'm not belittling the fact that there are security issues, but this is, hopefully it's a blip that will end soon.
As you were speaking, I am reminded that the omnibus that Congress, agreed to and is likely to pass this week includes $1 billion more for refugees, most of that for refugees living abroad or who are internally displaced. Republicans control both houses of Congress. While, Democrats may have gone to the mat over what they called a poison pill, restrictions on the resettlement of refugees, I don't think could have done much if Republicans refused to increase funding for refugees. Those decisions tend to be made by the senior Republican appropriators, so maybe it's evidence that there's still that history of the bipartisanship remains strong, at least at the senior levels of the committees. So.
Good.
Let's turn it over to the audience for questions.
I'm Pam Bailey. I do a lot of work in Lebanon, go back and forth a lot, originally with Palestinian refugees and now with Syrians. So I have one question for Michel and one for Sam. For Michel, I just wondering what you think about camps. There's a lot of debate in Lebanon because they have not established camps for the Syrians. And I'm sort of mixed. I'd like to hear what your point of view about camps versus no camps and what's better. For Sam, I was wondering if there's any hope at all to streamline it takes so long. Before this thing happened in Paris, there was actually some movement, I thought, towards trying to streamline and shorten that a little bit because it's so much longer than anybody else. But now I'm wondering is that gone? Is there no chance given all the concerns?
So first, as a background on the region, when the Iraqi initially and the Syrians came, the reaction of all the countries in the region was not to call them refugee, to call them guests, and not to open camps, because both the word refugee and camps meant we buy ourselves a Palestinian problem for the next 50 years. So they say we will try to avoid that sort of image.
Could I just explain, when Michel says a Palestinian problem, the Palestinians are encamped. Yeah. Because that's been decades, so they are encamped.
The debate camp, no camp, is very the order of the day now in the humanitarian community. Traditionally, humanitarians have reacted very well to camps. You have a captive population, you set the whole system, you control what you do, and if you have enough resources, you can even have camps that are a decent place where to live for some time. But they create a tremendous amount of dependency because you cannot have people becoming self-sufficient in camps. And every humanitarian crisis over the years see a dramatic attrition on the resources that it receives because other crises crop up somewhere else and resources are redirected. So the mood now is to moving away from camps. And most agencies have defined urban refugee policies, etc., that are not necessarily badly written, but are finding the delivery of, in programmatic terms, painful right now because allocation of resources is not really made in proportion to the number of refugees who are outside of camps. Outreach is much more complicated. You have to find where people are, who are the most vulnerable. They have very different needs. And host communities cannot be ignored because very often you have host communities that are also very poor. Refugees have few means, so they tend to settle in the urban neighborhoods where the poorest strata of the host community lives. And you cannot have one and not the other. So all of a sudden, what does that do to your budget? How do you appeal to donors? And all these things have not been resolved. There have been some improvements in the Middle East, which were quite interesting. It was to give refugees ATM cards. So the UN basically manages their accounts, puts some money every 2 weeks so they don't exhaust it in the first half of the month, and they can decide what they need. It's either my kids to school or better apartments, etc. It's not the sort of standard relief you get when the international organizations come and say you need a blanket and the sort of model relief tool that doesn't suit everyone. So these can be improved in urban environment, and certainly in the Middle East, which is basically which has an urban tradition. Unfortunately, the systems are not yet well operational, and I think it's something we are pushing ourselves from my advocacy organizations right now, is to get, for example, the UN, etc., to allocate resources much more clearly to their urban programs. But it's something in process.
First, thank you for helping in Lebanon. It's quite a scene. With respect to speeding up the process, it is unlikely to eliminate steps. So the issue is, can the steps be more collapsed? And that is a question of funding, staffing, commitment of the agencies, because there's a limit to the ability to shift people around. And some of these, especially looking forward, there are going to be even more demands. The refugee program is important to many of us, but the same people who are vetting refugees, at least some of them, are also looking at visa applicants, are looking at a lot of other people trying to come to the United States. Refugees are a priority in a sense, but they're mixed in with a lot of other priorities. So while there are dedicated and good people working on it, there probably aren't enough, and there's not enough money, and we're not going to eliminate steps. I think security of refugee admissions is not going to ratchet back down. So the question is, you're asking the right question, but I think it has to be money, people, effort, resources.
My name is Stephen Davis. I'm a longtime member of the World Affairs Council. Thanks for bringing some reason and some facts to a debate that's often characterized by hysteria, and for your professionalism. It seems that the refugee issue could be expanded by simply stating that treating refugees well, humanely, and decently is a powerful antidote to the message that ISIS is trying to proclaim. That seems to be one of the most powerful arguments we could make for helping refugees. I'd like your assessment of that.
Well, I agree with that, certainly.
All right.
Agree.
That brings us to the end of our discussion. We'll adjourn.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.